Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Global Development. I'm Amanda Glassman. I'm the Vice President for Programs here. And I'm really pleased to be moderating this panel this morning with a very illustrious group. So, as you know, the private sector is really the engine of economic growth and well-paying jobs in low middle-income countries, in our own country as well. And without the engagement of private companies, a lot of the big goals on gender, the new set of global goals, won't be met. So the question that we're posing to our panel is really how private companies can think about how they support the global goals on gender more strategically, and in particular, focusing on the role of corporate social responsibility. Traditional corporate social responsibility efforts have sometimes fallen quite short. They've focused on, let's say, royalties associated with natural resources that are used to build a clinic or a school that then later isn't staffed, or it can grow through a foundation and it's mainly marketing. I'm talking a worst case scenario. But there are also some really interesting new approaches that we'll talk about on this panel. And we'll start off, let me just say a little bit about the Center for Global Development. We're currently focused on what we're calling beyond aid strategies to improve women's economic empowerment and status. And that program is led by my colleague Myra Buvanich and Charles Kenny. But our star here is Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Nicholas Kristof, who has just published a very interesting book that will be on sale in the back after this event. It's called A Path Appears, Transforming Lives and Creating Opportunities. And Nick has really been a champion for a long time of these kinds of issues that affect women and girls in low and middle income countries. So let's start off with you. Tell us a little bit, what do you think, what is corporate social responsibility? How do companies normally use CSR to approach the issues of gender equality? And what other innovative things have you seen? What do you hope to see more of in the future?
Sure. Well, great to be here and welcome. And first of all, just thanks to CGD. Every year I have a win a trip contest, and I take a student with me on a reporting trip to the developing world. The joke within the New York Times is that first prize is 1 trip with me, second prize is 2 trips with me. But for the last, I don't know how many years, CGD has helped screen the torrent of applications that come in. And so if you were ever not a finalist, blame CGD.
Truly, don't blame me.
Truly, thank you very much for helping that, and also just for being a voice, calling attention to some really important issues that don't get enough attention. And as a journalist, I'm acutely aware that we in the news business are dropping the ball on a lot of these issues, and it becomes even more important in that environment to have groups like CGD picking it up and continuing that attention. If we don't get attention on these issues, they won't get addressed. So on CSR, my interest originally came to this because of scale. If you want to see how you can make a difference, then any NGO compared to corporate America is just tiny. And so if you want to really have an impact, then what a company can do with internal practices, with hiring, with sourcing of goods, with supply chains, just puts the NGO sector to shame. That's where you can really have a broad impact. And yet, I think traditionally, corporate social responsibility has really been largely disappointing. That it's mostly been a marketing gesture. It's often been kind of a fringe activity on the side. If you are working for a company and the CEO calls you up and asks you if you want to be head of CSR, then you know that your future on the corporate ladder is in great jeopardy. It's kind of a marginalized area. And it really has been largely about public relations. I think that is changing. And I think it's changing because it's in companies' own best interest to make this more real for reasons of recruitment and retention and branding. You look at some of the firms out there that for which branding is incredibly important, and that are hiring a lot of millennials who care about these issues. You look at Apple, Facebook, Google, and their CSR programs have really largely been pretty pathetic. I think that is going to change, and I think it's not going to change because of the board members are suddenly going to have this notion that they want to make a better world, and it's going to change because to compete for the best workers, you're competing not only in the compensation you provide, but also on the identity your company has, its ability to make a change. And I think it's going to get more board attention, more CEO attention, and do better more broadly. And the ability of companies, for example, and it's also I think going to be less about what a company does on the side with kind of a little pet CSR project, and more what it does as its fundamental core business and core practices, its supply chain, its hiring practices, its ability in other countries to project values to hire women as managers, for example, to say that there's zero tolerance for certain behaviors. And I think that also is often going to be in a company's own best interest. American companies in Japan have benefited greatly because there is a market failure in Japan. Japanese companies underemploy really talented Japanese women. And so if you want to look at the most talented cadre of people who are available, often they are young Japanese women. And American companies have noticed that, have swept it up, and to the benefit of themselves and also of Japanese. I think that can be done in other countries as well. And I think Unilever is an interesting example of using, where CSR isn't shunted off to the side, but is precisely kind of the core part of what a company does. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in other companies. I guess I'd also just say that there are some cynics who say, companies are always just going to look after their own interests. This isn't really an area where we can have impact, that it's hopeless. And I don't think that's true, partly because there has been some progress, far insufficient. But also there are a couple of sectors where I think CSR is kind of a model. One is American law firms. We don't think of it as CSR, but pro bono work. Pro bono work is a significant part of what law firms do. And other is pharmaceutical companies, big pharmaceutical companies. And you look at what a company like Merck has done with ivermectin distributions, really making a huge dent in river blindness worldwide, has been hugely consequential. And the same is true of other drug companies. Why are law firms and pharmaceutical companies doing a better job than others? I think it's partly because of accountability and reporting, that in both cases you have outsiders judging how real CSR is. You have American Lawyer magazine rating pro bono programs, and you have likewise a rating of pharma CSR programs and the drug giveaways. And I think that likewise, to the extent we can bring that kind of accountability and measurement and data into the evaluation of other companies' CSR on issues like gender, so it's not just companies boasting about what they do themselves, but it's third parties saying that, here is what this company does well and here's what does not do well. So companies are citing that. I think that is one of the things that is kind of one way of taking this to the next level.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I omitted to introduce at the start Tom Langen, who is the Unilever's North America External Affairs Function Head. He's also a member of the global leadership team in this space. And I'm going to turn to you next, if that's okay, Myra, to tell us a little bit about how Unilever takes some of these ideas about creating shared value and brings them to your work in the area of gender equality.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you too, and thanks for not putting us on the pathetic list that you mentioned the companies. Yeah, it's actually an honor to be here and to be seen as a leader in this area, and it's humbling because I think in many ways we feel like we're just at the beginning of what we're trying to do with our sustainable living plan. I think there is a transition going on for companies, not just Unilever, a lot of other companies, from the old model of CSR being a corner office. You ask someone in a company, what are you doing on these issues? You say, go talk to the person at the CSR office. I don't know. And it became really, I think what we've seen and what we're trying to do is move from, this is whatever it's women empowerment, but this is not a PR program. It is a business growth opportunity for our business, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what we're trying to seize on and changing the way we approach it. And our sustainable living plan that we launched in 2010, that's really the heart of what we're doing in our business. And it is part of our growth model for our business. And we are integrating sustainability across the business all the way across the value chain. So if you look in our supply chain with suppliers, how we source raw materials to make our products, you look through our operations, our manufacturing, distribution, retail, and with consumers too. So we're integrating it across. So everybody in our business, all these functions now have ownership of this agenda. And this is part of where we're seeing growth in our business. So it is sort of a changed mindset that I think we're seeing, and you're going to see other businesses too. And let me also mention, not just across those areas, but in advocacy too. So I've been leading our advocacy work. I've been with Unilever for 20 years. What we're doing in advocacy is part of our sustainable living plan. We know that to reach the objectives that we reach for these very challenging problems, what we do on our own is by itself is not going to make a difference unless others join in. And we need initiatives like the Sustainable Development Goals, goal number 5 in particular, for businesses to work together, aligned with NGOs, government, and other aid organizations, others around the world, to start to have impact on these issues. And so advocacy is a big part of that. That's why we really made an effort to be an advocate leader in the space, in the post-2015 development goal area. So I'm feeling optimistic that things are changing, and I think that it's becoming clear, the business case for more and more companies.
And can you give us just a little follow-up? Can you give us an example in a specific country as part of your supply chain, how the work that you're doing to include this really works with one piece of your efforts?
Yeah, sure. Unilever is a very large company. Our products are in about 190 countries, and if there's more countries than that, they're probably distributed somehow to consumers. We make basic need products, so foods, personal hygiene products, and household laundry, cleaning, basic human needs products, really, in many cases. We also have, in other markets, developing markets, more luxury brands of personal care and other products. But we have been in these markets since the 1800s, so we've got a long history in these areas. We know that there are opportunities. What we have, for example, I'm going to give an example in India where there's a very large rural population that's hard for our business to meet. And we have a program, the Shakti program, that we're actually expanding into other markets, and where we can create economic opportunities for women to actually distribute our products, earn income that we know that actually helps benefits, because when women earn the money, they actually spend it back in their families on food, healthcare, education, that there's other societal benefits. But we have programs in a number of markets around the world like that we think are helping to create economic opportunities, bringing women into our supply chain. We are also doing things, we have some new partnerships on sourcing of our agricultural raw materials. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we have a new program with Acumen and the Clinton Foundation that we're doing in Africa, India, Latin America, and the Caribbean. We're going to be working with smallholders. And what we found, we originally started the Sustainable Living Plan. Our goal was to bring 500,000 smallholders into our supply chain. And as we've been doing research into this, we realized we already have 1.5 million smallholders in our supply chain. So we've changed the focus to helping them create economic opportunities. And we've also discovered that roughly 30% of our smallholders are women. And so we are now trying to figure out ways to work with and target the women in our supply chain with smallholder farmers too, to make sure that they have access to the opportunities that we're going to be employing for skill development, to help them improve their yields, help them manage their finances, importantly, as part of sustainably sourcing agricultural raw materials. So that's sort of some of the ways we're working, and that's a number of countries there.
Excellent. Well, that's a great segue then to Myra Buvinic, who is doing some work right now on this issue of women's economic empowerment and financial inclusion. Could you talk a little bit about your work, the how of women's economic empowerment?
Sure. Let me tell you sort of, talking about the private sector, why banks, in particular, are and should be the main actors in promoting women's financial inclusion. Obviously, I think we all know that women, there's still a big gender gap in access to banks and access to bank accounts. We have wonderful data now from Findex. And, more people around the world are increasing having access to bank accounts, but still the gender gap has not budged. It's 9 percentage points globally, and it has not budged. Among the poor, the gap in having access to bank accounts is much larger. So, women want savings in particular. And we know that savings really increase women's incomes, much more so than credit. And there's a great report where I collaborated, but it's from the UN Foundation and the ExxonMobil Foundation, that gives you empirical evidence from randomized controlled trials that savings really make a difference and that women really want to have formal savings. We also have now new evidence, not from a randomized controlled trial, from a country that I know very well, is Chile. And there's a report that is just going to come out from the Global Banking Alliance for Women, the Inter-American Development Bank, and Data2X, which I also work on. And it's very interesting. What Chile did in the first government of Michelle Bachelet, she asked the banks to disaggregate data by gender. And she asked this through the Superintendency of Banks. So the main regulatory body in the country asked banks to do this. There's now data for 14 years. Interestingly enough, at first, the banks did not have sex disaggregated data. So the government had brought the data and sort of paired it with civil registration data, with ID data to find out the sex of the clients. But now, the banks have been providing the data every year. There's data for 14 years, and it's pretty amazing when you see the data. In credit, loans, there's a big gap. Obviously, men ask for more loans, higher volumes. Savings. Women have been, since the start, since 2002 to 2014, the main clients of saving products. By now, 68% of the savings accounts in Chile are by women, owned by women. So I think that what is it? What is the magic of savings for women? There are a number of theories. And, first, there's some empirical evidence. Women use savings to invest in their businesses. Women are a bit more risk averse than men, which is probably not that bad, as we have seen in the past. And if they want to start a business, they will save. But women are subject to a lot of pressures, particularly when they have cash. So to have family pressures, to disburse some of the money, particularly if it is cash, to family. So if they have a savings account, a formal savings account, and that formal savings account is private and is secure, and even more so if it's a mobile savings account, where there are a lot of advantages, obviously, of mobile savings, women will use those savings to invest in their businesses, and this will increase growth, the growth in their income in their businesses. So what we have to do, I think, is provide women, and this is what banks have to do, is provide women with access to secure formal savings accounts. Now, what we're going to be doing here, and this is with the support of the ExxonMobil Foundation, we're going to be working in 2 different countries, in Tanzania and Indonesia, and testing and seeing if, in fact, mobile savings really increase women's earnings. And it has a twist. You know, all the time, sort of, it has been, I think the tendency has been to provide women with access to education, to financial literacy, you know, sort of because women have had less education than men, et cetera. So everything, I think a lot of the interventions that are gender interventions have focused on the demand side of an increasing women's capacities so that they can access modern products. What we're doing in Tanzania, we're doing that, and we are varying 2 levels of business training, light training and heavy training, and seeing if women will access savings, mobile savings through a mobile phone company, Vodacom. In Indonesia, however, and this I think, it's an important lesson, I think, we are also working on the supply side because, you know, there has been very little done on really sort of customizing products so that they meet women's needs. So what we are going to be doing, and I think that is a big sort of is where we should be going now. You know, we have trained women, we have given them the education, but oftentimes we assume, well, you know, all these financial services, products, services in general are gender neutral. They're not. They have been made with men in mind. And they have not been made with accessing women's constraints. So what we're going to be doing in Indonesia is working on the supply side and providing incentives to bank agents, and this is with a big bank, Bank Mandiri, to see that they can sort of focus and target women clients of services.
That's terrific.
So,
I think that's
more to come.
Two very practical strategies that one might think about in terms of how companies might support gender goals. Nick, let's go back to you. I'm struck by the foundations, corporate foundations that have been successful and that have done really interesting products, but that they're attached to corporations that have also had a lot of difficulty in their supply chain on some of the exact same issues. So the garment industry might be a classic example, right? Where there are very prestigious and well-known foundations, definitely working in the right areas and having an impact, but then, you know, sourcing things from, let's say, garment factories that have occupational and health safety issues or something like that. How would you advise a corporate foundation and the corporation itself to try and think about bringing these ideas together in a way that would be useful for the goals that we're talking about?
Well, I think, very often to the extent that CSR was a PR exercise, then it became more important for a corporation when it totally screwed up and was embarrassed to then funnel money into a foundation. The Goldman Sachs, for example, is a terrific CSR program empowering women and girls around the world. And I was always kind of delighted whenever Lloyd Blankfein would say something particularly Neanderthal, because then there would be outrage, and I knew they'd have to funnel more money into the foundation. So girls in Liberia would end up benefiting from impolitic things said by Lloyd Blankfein. But that's still, and that's great. That model, that's certainly much better than nothing. But I do think that the direction we're going in is much more not shunting things off to a foundation or something on the side, but really bringing it into the way corporations behave. And that's what I would encourage more companies to do. And I'd also encourage them to do it partly for these reasons of recruitment and retention, that if they can get employees excited about a program, excited about what the company is doing, and engaged in it, and maybe it's with some volunteering element or whatever it may be as well, then I think that that is really in a company's own interests. And I guess I'd say in the area of gender too, that it's important for the company and for everybody to realize that the end result here is not just this seemingly soft issue of empowering women or girls. That's that's great, and it's great to have gender equality, but there are much broader gains to a society. And one of the, when women have more control over assets or income, their children do better. And there are some terrific studies in South Africa, for example, that where a grandmother gets a social welfare check, then the grandchildren that she is taking care of gain more weight and height than if it's a grandfather who is getting the money. There are, in many African countries, there are women's crops and men's crops. If you look at the years when there are bad harvests when more money goes to women because there have been good harvests for women's crops, then child enrollment rates in school, for example, will go up. And more broadly, since 9/11, we've been engaged in this big exercise in how we improve international security, how we address terrorism and violence, and we've invested hugely in the military toolbox, not hugely successfully. And as somebody who has spent a lot of time running around Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iraq and Yemen and Syria and so on, I've got to say that investing in the women's empowerment toolbox more broadly really does have an effect on those broader social issues. And mechanisms are multiple. One of them seems to be the youth bulge in the population. That one of the things that is most destabilizing for society is having a youth bulge. How do you reduce the youth bulge 10, 15 years from now? You empower women today, and they will have fewer kids down the road. So let's remember that this isn't just sort of a fringe issue about empowering women. It's really about changing societies more broadly in ways that benefit men as much as women.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to you, Langan. When we think about what you've mentioned, this idea of like looking at the shareholders that your supply chain buys from, and we've heard about savings accounts are a good idea, and maybe you're doing direct deposit and savings accounts. I mean, are you testing whether this really makes a difference for your bottom line or not? Can you tell us a little bit about how you evaluate the success of these kinds of interventions? Because it is maybe it's an additional cost or maybe it's not.
Yeah, great question. So under our Sustainable Living Plan, the women's empowerment pillar was new we added it in 2014. And over that time, we've actually been doing a lot of research and collaborating with other companies, groups like CDG, other NGOs, around the best ways to measure, looking at how do people measure outcomes. And most of it is very traditional, the number of people that went through a training program or, the whatever it is, those type of very data-driven metrics. And what we're trying to work on and we're trying to figure out now, I think this is still an evolving area, is how do we measure the social benefit of these programs? And that's what we're committed to doing. We're going to be having a number of things that will be coming out over the next months and year, but that's one of the areas that we're going to be looking at. We want to have a system where we can measure not only the number of people that have go through our training program, but also really what benefit has it had, economically and socially. And how do we do that? I don't think is an easy answer. But that's something that we're going to have to collaborate with other groups on the ground, NGOs and governments that are authorities in these, and partner with people that have expertise in these areas to see if it is making a difference.
And it works for your bottom line too?
Yeah, so I really appreciate the case here about women's and financial empowerment. If you look at our business, 70% of the purchasing decisions for our products are made by women. Probably a little more than that. When you think about it, and it's probably my house, women are buying for families often. And so they're disproportionately buying a lot of things like foods, grocery, personal care, hygienes, laundry soap, things like that. So the more they have economic power, the better it is for our business. Absolutely. That's part of our motivation. It's not just, hey, this is a charity or this is a great PR thing to do. We really believe this is going to help us grow. And our business too, now over half of our business is in the developing markets. And that's where our growth has been. And it's slowed recently because the developing market economies have slowed, but still where our majority of our growth is, getting close to 60% of our business. So we think that the more we can address these social problems and have opportunities for people to buy move into the markets for our products, clearly helps our business. Our products also help address social issues too, whether it's sanitation, hygiene, nutrition, other areas.
Excellent. Myra, can you reflect a little bit on other kinds of unexploited opportunities to, you've mentioned savings as one possible tool that corporations might have available to promote the global goals in this area. What else has come up in your research?
There's a lot that needs to be tested still, but let me first say one, and I think, picking up on the point of data, that's one key thing that corporations and banks, banks still don't disaggregate their client data by sex, or at least don't put out this information. But once they have the information, that's where things can start changing, and the importance of data to make these corporations realize that their customers are mostly women. So, then you have a real interest to focus on women and to empower women because your customers are women. In the case of Chile, it was very interesting. Once banks realized that women were a majority of the savers, now what they have started doing when they do customer satisfaction surveys, they disaggregate their data by gender. That's, the beginning, I think.
You would have thought they were already doing that. I mean, what's the problem? Marketing, right? Basic
you
marketing?
would have thought, but they, And I think that this is, here it's in these productive services where we have, where we still have the preconceptions that these things are gender neutral. They're not. Agricultural extension services are not gender neutral. That's, a really good report by the World Bank and the One Campaign that shows that even when women have access to agricultural extension services, the way the agricultural extension services are given benefit men more than women, so there's increased productivity of men versus women. So anyway, one interesting, I think, idea that has been, has been piloted, needs to be tested more, is this thing of firm certification, certifying corporations and firms when when they are employing women and doing good things for women in the company, and that can trigger sort of dramatic changes in terms inside the company and for the employment of women.
Interesting. Now that's a great segue then back to you, Nick. So there are laws on the books in a lot of countries about legal discrimination or regulations that would try to deal with this, that would try to influence corporate behavior or private firm behavior in those countries. Can you talk about the effectiveness of those kinds of measures versus a kind of self-regulation approach where corporations move towards this more internally driven focus on gender equality?
I'm something of a skeptic of both the capacity of laws in countries with poor governance to have much of an impact on labor markets and the capacity of purely self-regulation to have much impact. In very poor countries, laws maybe matter a little bit within the capital if you're not related to the president. But I was talking earlier about FGM and Guinea. Sudan banned FGM beginning in the 1920s. Guinea has a very, very tough law against FGM, and 99% of girls in Guinea are still cut. So I think laws are fine, but we shouldn't put too much confidence in their capacity to change labor markets. Child labor laws we've seen, that aren't very effective. Likewise, self-regulation. I'd say they have not been hugely successful. I do think that this question of kind of outside monitoring, the certification approach that you mentioned, I think that that actually does have promise. You look at the impact of LEED certification in architecture. It's been hugely important. Or as I mentioned earlier, the impact on outside accountability of law firm pro bono work or pharmaceutical drug donations. It's been hugely important. And so I think that one bit of leverage one has to improve gender equity in firms is some of this monitoring by groups that provide some kind of objective standard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the certification idea is interesting, but Tom, from a private sector point of view, how much do you love certification programs? How many are you currently participating in? And, is there like a website that has all of your five-star ratings? Or
So when you look at, especially in areas where we're sourcing our agricultural raw materials, we have a number of approaches to it. And in some markets, we do rely on third-party groups to work on certification for the practices that go on with the sourcing. Or we work with the Rainforest Alliance, Fair Trade, other organizations that are on the ground because it's difficult for us to do that. In other markets, developing markets, we work with our vendors and we do verification processes with them. But it depends on the degree of risk, I would say, in the different markets. I think they do have a role, third-party verification and certification organizations, so it's something that we are using in different areas,
Interesting. And Myra, what do you think the role of international agencies is in this space between firms and governments and consumers?
Well, usually, they can be, the sort of the intermediary between firms and governments. And particularly, as we have, we now are in a globalized world. It's a global market. These firms, the corporations that can make a difference are global. And there's where, sometimes it's more difficult maybe the interaction between a national government and a global company, and where international agencies can come as intermediaries and promoters of these issues, and stimulating both the private sector and governments to join forces sometimes and to work on these things. I think, the example of the case of Bachelet in Chile and doing this, she worked, well, that's not an international agency, but she was able to get a regulator, a national regulator, to start doing this, and then came the private sector united. And hopefully, the international agencies can do that, the World Bank, the IDB, particularly, in the subject of women's economic empowerment, I think is there where the MDBs could play a tremendous role.
Okay. Do you have any, I'm going to turn to the audience now, but would you want to respond to that?
One case that occurs to me where you have sort of inspection or certification regimes that I think has had an impact is infant formula. Here, initially you had this big debate way back in the 1970s about companies irresponsibly marketing infant formula in ways to discourage breastfeeding, and that damaged companies' brands. It led to situations where companies put much more emphasis on this, and it's a complex issue because on the one hand you want to have infant formula available in poor countries. On the other hand, according to Lancet, 810,000 kids die each year worldwide because of non-optimal breastfeeding practices. And if you want to think how you can save a lot of kids' lives each year, improving optimal breastfeeding practices in very poor countries would certainly be part of that. I think there's a misperception in the West that most of that 810,000 has to do with irresponsible behavior of formula companies, which is completely untrue. Mostly it's in areas where there's no infant formula available at all, and very, very poor countries. But there still is a problem with with marketing in cities, but the companies are rated every year they're scrutinized, they compete with each other for these ratings, and while I'd say there are still problems in formula marketing in poor countries, the situation is hugely improved over a generation ago, just hugely improved. And I think that's an interesting example of what we would like to see elsewhere in various sectors.
Okay, great. Do you want to add something? No? Okay, so let's go to the audience then. We'll take questions or comments in batches of 3. Brevity is, of course, great. And you should introduce yourself and say where you work if relevant. So let's start over here on the right side.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Vasquez with We Connect International. Love what was said. Thank you. Curious to understand your perspectives on how to encourage corporations to leverage their purchasing power with women suppliers in particular, because I understand women in the labor force, women in factories, but the women, if we're talking about asset ownership and building asset ownership, it's actually the entrepreneurs, the business owners who have the greatest opportunity to not leverage the millions from the foundations, but the billions of dollars in the products and services that corporations buy, and would love your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Terrific. Let's go in the far back.
Hi, my name is Rachel Menino, and I'm from the Peace Corps headquarters right down the street. And I just wanted to get I have 2 questions. One is, a year ago, Peace Corps launched the Let Girls Learn initiative to specifically address access to adolescent girls' education, secondary education in particular. So I was wondering what role secondary education plays in your work in particular. And I was also wondering, Peace Corps' approach to global development is specifically to have our volunteers all over the globe working at the grassroots level with each community, sometimes out in the middle of the bush, to solve their own problems with identifying how they can get more women to break down the barriers to girls' education or to women's empowerment or gender equity. So I was wondering if your approach is more a top-down approach, or if you're really more invested in that grassroots community solving their own problems and helping them to actually bring that to fruition.
Okay, great. Thank you. Front row. I'm making people really run around. Sorry. Please.
Hi, I'm Erica Bradas, PhD student in public policy at George Washington University. My question is really simple. You talk about women saving, which I'm absolutely all for, but I'm curious, are they doing this in secret, understanding the challenges that are going on perhaps in their households, and whether or not they actually have power? Maybe that's my question. Do they really have power over the way that that money is then used?
Okay, great. So we'll respond to that, then we'll go back out to you. So first, how to think about purchasing. Do you have an affirmative action policy in the identification of suppliers of certain inputs into your supply chain, Tom?
Well, so in some cases, we would, in some markets, affirmative action would be required where we're trying to meet, we are trying to meet our commitments on standards on this. We have gender balance is one of our goals in our plan. Of course, that is for us internally, but also with our suppliers too. So we have a supplier code where we're working on them with them to meet, to try to encourage gender balance within their organizations too. So it's, I don't know if it gets to all the question that they're asking, but if it's about our purchasing power, I think that is an area where we working with our suppliers and implementing our standards and encouraging our suppliers to also adhere to things like the UN Global Compact, other things like that, participate in those initiatives and meet those international standards. I think that's part of what we're doing.
But Myra, do you want to say something about the question about inter-household negotiation or savings or
Sure,
managing
privacy.
money inside households?
Yeah, just also let me just say,
please.
since you were asking about the role of the international agencies, the regional development banks, I think, can really sort of identify and try to motivate women business owners to provide link with big corporations. And I think We Connect is doing that with Inter-American Development Bank, and I think the regional banks in general would have that capacity, really, to increase the women's-based suppliers of services and goods. On savings and secrecy, yes, secrecy is important, precisely because there has been really interesting experimental evidence that shows that when the amount that you save is visible, women much more so than men feel family pressures to give away some of that money. Men don't. So secrecy is important, I think, for women to keep their savings secret so that they can do whatever they want with them. Security is also very important, obviously. They have to be secret, but they have to be secure. There has been some experiments with ATMs, for instance, I think it was in the Philippines, where the ATM could be used. The ATM was used for savings, but it could be used by the husband and the wife. And then what happened is both husband and wife did joint savings, and then men did individual savings, but women decided they weren't going to put any individual savings into that account because they were afraid that they were not going to have a secure. So I think that the design challenge, that is not that big, is to build savings products that are secure and that are private, and obviously that are in the formal sector, that they are formal saving products, not informal.
Yeah, that last piece is really important. So, Nick, you've been challenged. Are you more grassroots or top-down or both? And what about education?
Both, but I think I would put an emphasis on the importance of grassroots. I mean, I think that often the mistake that we've made in all kinds of development programs, not just education, is that we sit around a conference table in Washington, D.C. and come up with a brilliant plan, and and don't listen to people at the grassroots. And the health interventions, and I've worked better at. I mean, top down for health has a somewhat better record, but for a lot of other things, including education, the classic thing is when people think, okay, how am I going to get more girls in high school? I'm going to build schools. And I mean, nothing wrong with building schools, but the big problem in education in poor countries is not how to build a school, it's how do you get teachers to show up? How do you get books in the hands of kids? And that is harder to solve from the top down. And what we're also finding is that a lot of the shrewd ways that get more kids in school require some kind of fundamental knowledge from people who were living in the grassroots. About 10 or 15 years ago, there was a lot of excitement about the idea that girls were dropping out of high school around the world because of menstruation issues. And it seems sort of funny that this would only sort of occur to people in the last, and recently, I mean, but because it's a taboo topic, so it was something that people had a hard time asking about. And when they finally did get around to asking, it seemed to be a major reason why girls drop out, that they stay home during their periods, get more and more behind, finally drop out. But this is hard stuff. And so there have been various efforts to try to figure out what would help. And one study in Ghana found that helping girls with menstruation products, with hygiene products, reduced female absenteeism by half. Another in Nepal found the girls really appreciated the help. It had no impact on school attendance. One in Tanzania found it helped, but that bicycles, so the girls could go to school, helped more and more cost effectively. It's hard, and it requires, I think, a lot of listening to people and a lot of local decision makers and asking what they need, and figuring out accountability mechanisms so teachers do go to school, so that if textbooks are sent to the school, that the principal doesn't immediately confiscate them and sell them on the market in town. But having said that, I do think that we've also learned that there are some top-down initiatives that with local knowledge can make a difference. One of the most cost-effective ways to get more, two of the most cost-effective ways to get more girls in high school One is salt iodization. If you iodize salt or give women iodine capsules when they're reproductive age, then that any female fetus that they carry is going to be less likely to be iodine deprived, is going to have about 10 more IQ points, is going to stay in school a dozen years later for an extra year on average, according to one randomized control trial. And it's incredibly cheap. Deworming of kids when they're very young keeps kids in school longer, reduces absenteeism, reduces anemia, things like that. School feeding programs started out as this effort to improve nutrition in poor countries. Kids are malnourished. How do we get food in them? School feeding program. It turned out to be pretty disappointing as a nutrition program because if parents knew that their kid is going to be fed at school, they'd be less likely to feed the child at home. But they turned out to be brilliant as an education program because they created an incentive to send your child to school. And so, I guess what has struck me time and again is just how complicated it all is, how lessons from one country don't always apply to another, how one needs top-down knowledge and randomized control trials, but you also need to do just a lot of listening at the local level and a lot of tweaking.
Yeah, I mean, I think which underscores this idea of data, testing, and evaluation to figure out what's really going to work for both parties that are involved in this equation. And I mean, I should say that we have done some work here at CGD looking at, how natural resource rents or royalties from oil exploitation or from trees or something like that, maybe that should go to cash transfers to women in lieu of giving it to local governments to build a stadium or school construction. I mean, maybe that's something quite practical that you could imagine a corporation doing that would really change things.
I think
it's a good idea,
I may
right?
be making this up, but I think Nescafe pay coffee workers in Central America. Instead of giving the money to the male coffee worker, the money is transferred to the woman in the household, so that she gets control over that income.
But you know something?
Yeah, that's
Most coffee workers are women.
yeah. So they'll keep that money.
America.
Yeah.
They're not in the
interesting
statistics
idea.
because the statistics are bad. But who picks the coffee in Central America? 90% are women. At least
And then
the
we
last.
men are good at
the
taking
last
the bags
right,
to
and
get paid.
Maybe they were subcontracted. Okay, so let's go back to the audience. 3 more in the back.
Good morning. It's great to have this, to be having this conversation. Valeria Budinic from Ashoka. Yeah, and this question is a bit personal for each one of you. The kind of work that you do, either through your book, Nick, or through your research, Mayra, or through the work of Unilever, it's all it's all helping to make visible something that each one of us as an individual, and particularly from the perspective of markets and corporations, we basically don't see the opportunities that relate to women empowerment. We don't see it as core and central to business development. So the question that is personal is, in your experience, what kind of conversations are the most effective? What kind of examples really get people to that level that they see, oh my God, I'm in the coffee industry and most coffee workers are women. And I would challenge that it's not just research. It's about mindset change. It's about us having a different perspective on intrapreneurship and entrepreneurship.
Okay, great. Up second row here with the start.
Hi, I'm Shamrukh Mohyuddin. I'm from Bangladesh, which has seen extreme progress in women's economic empowerment, thanks to the garment industry, but also Grameen and BRAC. So I have a grassroots view, but also in the US, I'm working at the US Chamber of Commerce Foundation at the Corporate Citizenship Center on particularly gender issues. So my question is twofold. One is on the data side, how can companies really help with the data collection and disaggregation? Mayra, you mentioned on the banking side there could be more done for disaggregation. But more broadly, what can the private sector do with their tremendous reach and scale in terms of collecting information and data, especially when it comes to women's self-agency? And secondly, you talked about CSR being kind of an afterthought, which is very much the case in the case of many companies, except Unilever and a few others too, I would say. But how can we, when it comes to advocacy issues, really help link CSR with government relations so that CSR is part of the DNA of a company, and any company is not talking from two different sides when it comes to government relations and advocacy on the behalf of women, as well as what they're doing on the supply chain side. Thank you.
Okay, great question. And then in the, let's go third row. I'll come back to you. Sorry.
Thanks. I'm Mary Beth Hastings. I'm with the Iris Group. One of the issues that Melinda Gates has just raised is unpaid work, and that's one of the sticky gender issues. What role do corporations have in decreasing the disparities between men and women in terms of unpaid work?
Mm-hmm. I'd love to know that question. Answers to that question. Okay, how to make the right kinds of arguments that women's economic empowerment or attention to this issue is central to the business case and the bottom line. I mean, tell us, Tom.
Yeah, this is, I think, is a big area. It probably links in with the other questions about advocacy too. It really is, I think, getting businesses to understand the business case better. It's about education. This is the role of groups like CDG and others, that we need more businesses to understand facts like 90% of the women, 90% of the coffee employees there in Central America are women. There needs to be a lot more research and understanding of this to get businesses to understand the business case and to develop this as part of their business model, and see it as a growth opportunity that it is, that we see. Mm-hmm. And how do you do that? I think it takes time. We're seeing more companies that are participating in a lot of different forums that are coming to this conclusion, but there's a lot more to be done, and I think groups like CDG and others are going to have a big role in make that happen. And I think from that, once you reach those conclusions, you understand that, and it's part of your business model. What we're doing in advocacy follows through in supporting our business agenda. I mean, whether we're lobbying on legislation or regulations that impact our products, or our growth plans that is linked to the whole sustainability agenda, women empowerment, others, we're advocating around those issues. So it will naturally flow into, I think, the advocacy area once we get that. And how do we get that? I don't know. I don't think we have all the answers, but I think we need more forums like the UN Global Compact, the World Economic Forum. We do a lot of work on there. New Vision for Agriculture, other areas where we're getting businesses to the table to understand the impact and the positive benefits, social benefits that we have that helps us. And a lot of these big companies too, like not just Unilever, are growing in the developing markets. Mm-hmm. And I think we're seeing more and more people coming around to that.
Okay, I'm happy to attend WEF next year, because I know that they probably need to improve their face to the world. Okay, data, CSR, this idea also, can I go back to you, Tom, on the relationship between CSR and government relations within a firm? How do you see that issue?
Yeah, so I think what I was just saying, I do think for us, it comes down to once it became part of our business model, what we're doing in government relations is supporting our business. And so it becomes not just a altruistic advocacy thing that we're doing for a PR reason. Mm-hmm. It is part of our business plans and growth. Yeah. I mean, whether it's climate change, we've been very vocal on that, and here in Washington, other places, maybe to not great success legislatively, of course, but we're starting, it's a long-term effort to try to build the business voice around that. We've made some great strides there with the food sector and other sectors really speaking up around the need for action in those type of areas. And it becomes, because of the work of a lot of the groups that we're partnering with, NGOs and others that have the understanding about what the impact climate change is having on us, our supply of raw materials, the risks it presents to our business, and the impact that comes down heaviest in developing markets where we're growing, where a lot of our consumers are and our supply base in many cases are, that for us to act on issues like climate change is part of our business agenda. It's not something separate. And I think that's going to take time, and we need more companies to follow that model.
Nick, do you want to comment on that issue of how corporations think about the issues, what kinds of arguments need to be made, or data, what kinds of data needs to be marshaled?
I mean, I defer to you and an awful lot of people in the room. I do think that advocacy is such a powerful tool on this front, and that, a lot of the countries, I'm just back from South Sudan actually, and a lot of the places I go to, companies are intimidated about using some of their leverage for fear of retribution. And industry associations have often been quite effective as one way around that. And I also think that, again, the benefits for recruitment, retention, branding also apply perhaps even more to advocacy than just to CSR in a narrow sense. I do think that traditionally, when I was young, my friends and I, our kind of actions to create a better world largely involved at the end of the year what checks we write to charity, sort of a 10-minute thing at the end of the year. These days, I think for a lot of millennials, their interaction, their decisions about how to make a better world involve the products they buy on a daily basis. Do they buy this or that? It involves their investment decisions. And it's social impact investing or socially responsible investing. And maybe most important of all, it involves the company that they go work for. And I think that all these things create much greater pressure on companies to behave responsibly and to advocate responsibly, and also create higher returns for those companies that do that.
Myra, tell us a little bit about the data question. How could companies help generate the kind of data that would be needed to document and value add for some of the firms? Sure. And then the big issue of dealing with women's unpaid work. What's the role of corporations and businesses in general at leveling the playing field in terms of differentials in wages?
Sure. Make vacuum cleaners. No, on data, and let me put my Data 2X hat, and I do that as well, and Data 2X tries to produce, bridge the gap and produce good gender data. I think, for advocacy, and Nick, advocacy is tremendously important, but you have to have good data to advocate. And there's where, in terms of gender data gaps, one of the largest where there's not only no data, but bad data, refers to women's economic participation. So bridging that, getting better data that will tell you that in fact the coffee farmers are women, the coffee pickers in Honduras and Guatemala are women, are not men, is tremendously important. And it's going to be tremendously important for the companies, because then they will realize that, in fact, those people who are involved in the labor force, who are producing, who are in small enterprises, are not only men. So I think that is tremendously important. On the unpaid, what has happened historically, and if you look with development, it's really getting women economic opportunities, which finally, goes back and solves the problem of women doing so much unpaid work. So while it is very important, obviously, and I think Melinda Gates' letter was great, it's very important to start changing culture and the cultural concepts that, men are at work and women are at home, which is not true. I mean, it's just a very Western concept, that one. But I think that what it will really make a difference is the expansion of women's economic opportunities, and that families will figure out ways, and that, women's work, in fact, women's unpaid work will be reduced as a result of that.
And I mean, some attention to the government as an employer, especially in really poor countries, and how they think about these issues, I think is something that should also be on the agenda. Okay, let's go back out. We have time for one more round in the third row.
Hi, my name is Wanji Kongare, and I'm from Dahlberg Global Development Advisors. My question is regarding hiring practices and my premise, first and foremost, is that you solve some of these issues when you have women at the table making the decisions. And I'm not exactly sure what Unilever's status is in terms of women in middle management and upper management, not just here, but also abroad in Africa specifically. So my question is, what are some ways that not just the Unilevers and the Cokes of the world, but the Safaricom's of the world can do a better job in hiring women at the lower level, but then also training them up to middle management and retaining them in the C-suite? Because in Kenya, for example, what we've seen is that Safaricom has done a fantastic job hiring women. But once it comes to middle management, they start to disappear. And once it comes to the C-suite, it's just really dismal. So what are some of the strategies that you've seen in your work, but also that Unilever has maybe employed at home as well?
Terrific. In the back here. I'm going to call on a man.
Hello, I'm Tazeen Hassan with the World Bank Women Business and the Law Program. So I have a question relating to, we cover discriminatory laws around the world, and we cover in particular, one area is labor restrictions. So women being prevented from working at night, women prevented from working in certain industries, such as the chemicals industry. So what can corporations do where those kind of restrictions exist in the law? Russia is one example, to actually advocate for the changes in those laws to allow women to enter into those companies.
Terrific question. Against the wall, and then I'll take one more to Nancy because she's a friend.
Hi, Luis Marquez from the Inter-American Development Bank, the gender team, actually. It's kind of a plug, but it's actually a question related to the Safaricom comment. We're actually starting and launching it in 15 days in New York, working with the Women's Economic Empowerment Principles of the UN Global Compact and a host of other different actors on where we're going to start developing a tool that's basically targeting these medium and large national companies on what they can do on these principles to promote gender equality. But I think one of our main concerns is, so you have the Unilevers of the world and the Coca-Colas, but let's say the Safaricoms and that's a pretty big company. I'm thinking more larger companies. How do they work, particularly on the supply chain issue? And how do they get women there? They don't have these huge global programs where they can be reaching 20 million women with probably a lot of money behind them. So how do we work with those people, and any ideas you might have on that end?
Excellent. And in the front row, Nancy.
Hi, Nancy Lee, Millennium Challenge Corporation. This is a great conversation. I just wanted to ask about the possibilities for collaborations across firms that share interests in terms of women's participation. You know, there are lots of firms that want to source from smallholder farmers, including those owned by women. There are lots of firms that distribute their products in women-owned small shops. There are lots of firms that need high skill levels or adequate skill levels for entry-level jobs, and they need women and girls to be part of that labor pool. So do you see the possibility that, and for the scale reasons that we started out with this conversation, firms could actually form partnerships, perhaps assisted by development institutions, to solve the collective action problem, to create scale when there are really a whole set of common interests which would improve their business models, reduce their costs, and increase their profits. So is that unrealistic, and can the development institutions do something to help on that?
Terrific. I think those. Nick, do you want to start with a response to these questions? First, hiring and promotion practices within some of the big corporations. Did you take a look at that? Labor restrictions for women and what could corporations do?
I think other people here probably have a better sense of this. I do think that one of the most important things we can do in other countries is modeling behaviors, and that where we tend to be quite unsuccessful is when we tell people from other cultures kind of what you're doing is barbaric, this is awful, and in contrast, what we have done that tends to be more successful is modeling behavior and sending women executives and likewise, I think that there is indeed, like some of the problem you raised with rules, laws in a number of countries that nominally protect women and actually discriminate against them is a huge problem. And I think that their advocacy, both by companies but also by international agencies and by embassies, can indeed chip away at them. It's not exactly the same, but I mean, Lesotho had a law about inheritance of assets by women, and the U.S. raised it, and Lesotho changed the law, so women can now inherit assets. And so I do think that there are that we have to use kind of every bit of leverage we can from every different actor there, and that modeling behavior may be the most effective of all.
Tom?
Yeah, so let me address a couple of those things. I think the one particularly you were asking about for Unilever. So within our target, our sustainable living plan, we have around a gender balance organization. So I think about it in two ways. One, we have our own operations employees, and we have a whole supplier base that we have influence over. So we clearly have goals within our own organizations for gender balance. Actually, I think in many ways we're doing pretty well. We're over 40% of our management level employees are women in our business, and across the business, from marketing, all the different functions. So we've got more to go. We're going for balance, and actually we're higher than that in the U.S. We're at, closer to like 48% in the U.S. But so we are seeing more women in management positions, and I think that is to your point, if it was about women being involved in hiring decisions, I think that is there, and it's part of what's going to be going moving forward, and we're seeing more of that. So trying to get to balance, and then with our suppliers, we have. Our own supplier code that I think I mentioned before, that we are requiring our suppliers to work in a number of different areas, including gender balance, and anything, times that we have to do work to make sure that there's enforcement of the code, that adherence to it, and monitoring. And when we find situations where suppliers are advertising for, whether it's legal for them, is the whole legality issue. In some places where it may be legal for them to advertise, this position that they want is for a man. But that doesn't meet our principles and our standards, and we have to work continuously to force that. We find suppliers that are doing pregnancy testing for women employees or things like that. That is not allowed in us, even though it may be legal under the local laws. So we do have to work to make sure that suppliers are meeting our standards and our commitments around this. And then there's the whole case, I think it was mentioned, around where there are actually laws that sort of force discrimination in other areas. That is a very difficult area. In our business, we're making products that are basic needs, foods, nutrition, health, and we're in markets around the world. And we know from our report, we participate in the UN human rights report. We do an annual report now for human rights in our business. And we know that from our risks from many places that there's probably 30 or so countries where there are very high risks of human rights violations. And in many cases, these are places where they're less than democratic governments and other means for us to address these issues. I don't think not selling basic need products and having business there is the solution, but constructive engagement, working with a number of others together to bring up these issues in a forum where we're tying it not to just our basic needs as a business, whatever, but to look at broader social issues that we can try to engage for progress with others on the ground there and other NGOs. And it's no simple solution to that, but it is one that we're aware of, and we are trying to be more transparent about all these issues through our human rights reporting that in many ways overlap with the whole gender issue of dealing with discrimination in other areas.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to say something about the collaboration across firms? Is that a feasible idea?
Yeah, I think it is. And, first of all, on an advocacy perspective, we're seeing more and more collaboration across firms, and whether it's groups like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the UN Global Compact, I mentioned WEF and others, where firms are working together on this. But then when you say on the ground dealing with different problems, And for us around commodities, we have firms collaborating, whether it's on palm oil issues that are going on there. You'll see these roundtables where a lot of firms are working together or with their competitors trying to address these problems together. I mean, there's more to be done, and we're open to whatever ideas groups come up with, but I think that is an area that we see some work, but obviously a lot more to be done there.
Yeah, great. Myra?
Sure. Let me just answer the Safaricom question, and I will go back to secondary schooling for girls. And just, I was in South Sudan about 4 years ago, and I was really impressed. I went to a secondary school. There were 12, 13-year-old girls. And it was amazing. We asked them, what do you want to become? And their aspirations were completely non-traditional. They wanted to be engineers. They wanted to be policemen. There was just no... So girls, the aspirations of girls have changed. But what has not changed is the quality of schooling and education. So, it's not only that you want girls to complete secondary school, you want that quality of education not to be sex stereotypical. You want girls to do good on STEM, to do good on math, and then, then they will be able to become middle managers. And that is, I think, for me, as important or more important than really getting girls to complete secondary schooling. And it's a huge task because you have to change the way teachers function and the way the incentives that teachers and just very, deep-seated, I think, cultural norms that girls are not good for math, that, continue here and there. Just so I think that's a huge challenge. It's obviously a challenge for governments. Our international organizations are very important. Just to pick up on Nancy's comment, I think yes, that development institutions have a huge role to play in bringing the private sector together and raising these issues. And the more that, and they provide a bit of an incentive to do that, the more, and a moral suasion, moral pressure, the more that they do that, the better.
Nick, thoughts? Okay, so I think we have 10 minutes until 12, but I think, are there any other burning questions? Okay, in the front row.
Don't need a mic. My name is Jen, and I'm the founder of 4 Girls Global Leadership. I actually believe there is a very great opportunity for CSR incorporation, and that is what Myra said, creating social change, social transformation. And I was with Girl Scouts, and Unilever and Dove did an excellent program with girls' self-esteem and really changing the mindset. Because at the end of the day, I feel like we're talking about token projects with, they're great programs, but without changing the mindset, girls are not valuable, they're not going to school, and it doesn't matter how many schools and great teachers there are. So how can we incentivize more corporations to do that and really to work with the civil society and social sector to change the mindsets of people?
Okay, right.
I'm Rebecca Regan-Sachs from TechnoServe. We've had the pleasure of working with Unilever, and hi, Myra. I was curious, given that so many of the obstacles to women's advancement are societal and have larger economic implications, what do you see as the role of businesses working with governments, or maybe against governments? I know it can be a sensitive issue, but how can you kind of nudge governments in the right direction to do their job and create an enabling environment for women's empowerment?
Okay, in the back. You, yes, go ahead.
My name is Nicole Graham. I'm an intern with the Hunger Project and a master's student at American. Thank you for your time today. Going back to Nick's comments on the recent Lancet study, and knowing that Unilever just topped the Access to Nutrition Index, I was wondering if Tom could speak a little more about the importance of Unilever's strategy for breast milk substitutes.
Okay, and here,
My name is Gretchen Bloom. I've worked on gender equality issues for quite a few years. and I've read every single article, Nicholas, that you've ever written. Thank you so much. And I even teach from your book, Half the Sky, when I teach students. So thank you for writing that. I've got to buy the next one.
Thank you.
But why are you the only person that ever writes about this issue? You're the lone voice. And the answers are so obvious. So please answer that question. I'd be very happy. And I want to shake your hand before I leave today. I have a picture with you.
Okay, let's start with you, Nick.
I must say I have enough trouble defending my own columns, let alone trying to defend the rest of the industry. So, on this last point, one of the things that I worry about is that I think these issues are indeed going to be covered less because they don't have a natural audience, and the business model for much of journalism is kind of collapsing. And everybody is desperate for ratings and audiences. And if you are the executive producer of a television show, you can send a camera crew halfway around the world to look at a situation in Eastern Congo, arguably the rape capital of the world. And it will be expensive and it'll be dangerous and your ratings will drop compared to your rival who puts a Democrat and a Republican in a studio together and has them yell at each other. And that is the huge challenge we face. So I was just in South Sudan last week. And I'm so lucky that the New York Times is supportive on this, but I know that my audience will drop very substantially for those columns compared to something that I whip off about domestic politics. And it's a hard sell for somebody who, especially an organization that is scrambling to trying desperately to stay above, to try to address these issues when your audience is gonna shrink overwhelmingly. And the other problem I think has to do with gender. I think that when women write about gender issues, I think often it's kind of marginalized that, it's a woman writing about it. And I think it also sometimes feels weird, frankly, for a man to write about it. And that's why Cheryl and I wrote together about these issues. But it's, I guess I would also just say that as we in the news media drop our coverage of some of these really important global issues in ways that will mean less attention and less resources go to them, then it becomes more important to everybody else to try to pick up that ball. Everybody has your own little spotlight. You have your water cooler conversation. You have your book club. You have your dinner table conversation, your Facebook page, your Twitter feed, whatever it is. And I hope that as we in the media drop the ball, you will do what you can to help continue shining a light on these issues.
Well, keep writing, Nick. So there's a question about working with governments, how business can work with governments to change norms and laws. What's your experience doing that in, let's say, in a friendlier government environment, so as not to...
Well, yeah, so I think as I alluded to earlier, I don't think we're going to do this on our own, and we have to work with others to affect change in these different countries where we know there are major problems and legalized discrimination in other areas. And we've got to do it together. We've got to have a constructive conversation that with these governments. We've got to have many people at the table, and I think, again, look at it, talk about it in a way that it's not just about us, it's about a broader social benefit for that country. And there's no easy answer for that. I don't pretend to have one. I think there's a lot more to be done. Obviously, big forums like through the UN and others where we are businesses, civil society, others are all working together, and as much as keeping the transparency out there for violations is important and critical. Businesses have to, I think, themselves be more transparent. This is not comfortable or easy for any company to do, but we need to create an environment that enables companies and in some ways almost rewards companies for being transparent to saying, there are human rights violations in our value chain. And as I mentioned earlier, we're doing an annual report on this, and there are very uncomfortable things that are in there. But the only way we're going to start to address the problems is if we start to talk about the fact that inequality exists. We can't just have programs that are going to address it without exposing for what it is. And companies that, the standard shouldn't be that companies are perfect and perfection. It should be where are they moving? What is their intent? Are they taking action? Are they making progress? And are they joining the voices? And that's I think the civil society, NGOs, the media, others can really start to, I think, encourage companies to do that. I mean, I think we were one of the first ones that did this following the UN standard for human rights reporting, but we'd love to see other companies start to do that. And again, not easy and not comfortable in many ways, but there's business benefits to that too, eliminating some risk in our operations, looking at it from investors' means. But so I think there's a lot that people can do. And I also mentioned on the Dove, because it was a question about how, and I didn't really talk about this, but I'll just quickly, for when we look for sustainability, including on women's empowerment, and it's across we talked about a lot of the programs in our supply chain, but it's across our business, including marketing. And we have what we call our brands with a purpose. And we have brands like Dove that have a clear purpose around self-esteem, and in many cases, soft ways around women's empowerment, around transforming the way we look at beauty to a point that it's about confidence and not about anxiety. It's about real beauty and other ways, in ways that I think makes people, even in our own industry, uncomfortable what we're doing. But we know that we have power of our brands, reaching 70% of our customers that are women. And you're going to see more from us. We're looking at ways, as we're going through our portfolio of brands to support our sustainability agenda, the Unilever State Living Plan. We are seeing more of our brands that are now finding ways to go after the women's empowerment issue. And I think hopefully you'll see more from us on that. But thank you for mentioning that.
Excellent. Okay, Myra, do you have any last comments?
I wanted to acknowledge our great partners. TechnoServe is working with us in this ExxonMobil-funded RCT in Tanzania, and in Indonesia is Mercy Corps. That's it. Thank you. And I say that I'm a great fan also of Nick, and Nick had the wonderful ability to bring women to CGD as the audience. It doesn't happen every day.
Here, women hold up about 95% of the sky.
Yes, this is not the typical gender balance for our events, but we're getting there. Okay, so alas, this is a great book, so take a look. Thank you so much. Do you have any last thoughts, Nick, to provide our audience?
Just one thought that I think sometimes when we talk about these issues, we get depressed by how much violence is happening, how many girls aren't getting educated, how many bad things are happening all over. And somebody asked about how one changes norms. In my reporting career, I have seen so much change on this issue. In primary school right now around the world, there's essentially no gender gap in education in primary school. Still is in so many other areas. 100 years ago, my wife is Chinese American, so I sort of think of this. 100 years ago, maybe the worst place in the world to be born female was China. You had female infanticide. You had concubinage. You had girls sometimes so devalued they didn't even get a name. They were just like third sister, things like that. And then things changed. And it happened partly because of education, partly because girls, those educated women were going into the labor force, they were earning money, they were getting assets, and because they had economic value, they tended to have social value and family value. I think that is the trend that we are going in, and I think it's important to acknowledge that progress, if only as a way to spur us to work harder on the continuing challenges.
That's right. Don't be discouraged by our domestic political elections. So, thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks so much to the panelists.